shove everything under the bed at the place where she lived at night. But it grew and grew and grew. We have now 2 fine buildings here in Bandung, built by Lottie Moon Christmas Offering funds.
In the area of theological education, the mission turned its attention to the coastal city of Samarang in central Java. In 1954, they established the Indonesian Baptist Theological Seminary under the direction of Dr. Buford Nichols. With mission sponsorship, new students came to the seminary in growing numbers, and it would become one of the largest Baptist seminaries in Southeast Asia. The work was going well. By 1956, there were 36 missionaries serving in 5 cities. 5 churches had been started with a total of 400 members, and more than 2,000 were enrolled in Sunday school. By the end of the decade, the number of missionaries had grown to 64, and church membership had climbed to nearly 1,600. The 60s saw even more impressive growth, and the first efforts outside of Java. On Sumatra, a medical clinic was started in the city of Bukittinggi, and a church planter was assigned to Palembang. Work was planned for the islands of Madura and Bali. But the most enthusiastic response to the gospel message was found among the Javanese people, the main ethnic group of Indonesia, and indeed one of the largest single people groups in Asia. The churches continued to grow, with new leadership being trained and new buildings built throughout Java. This despite growing political unrest within the country. The attempted communist overthrow in 1965 was a time of uncertainty for missionaries.
When we got here to Indonesia, we could feel the tension. We arrived here on March 27, 1965, and it was obvious, the street demonstrations, the slogans put up, the warnings, the advisories from the embassy and so on. It was a chancy time. Our first meeting with Indonesian Baptists, our annual mission meeting, another former missionary whom I won't name was just back from furlough, and she stood up and admitted tearfully that she hadn't really wanted to come back to Java in the current situation. And Betty and I thought, again, if she doesn't know what she's doing here, what in the world are we doing here?
The years that followed the coup attempt might best be described in terms of revival among many sectors in Indonesia, particularly among the Javanese.
Now, with this failure of the communist coup, and with the government strongly saying, you've got to have a religion, you've got to believe in God, many people were searching. Many people had been attracted to communism, and this left an utter vacuum in their hearts, including many, many Javanese people. And Baptists got to be in on the tremendous revival in Indonesia during the middle and late 60s and the early 70s. We were right in there in the midst of all of that.
In 1966, Baptist churches saw a 50% increase in the number of baptisms. By 1967, the percentage had doubled. More missionaries were sent to Indonesia, and by 1970, there were 111 missionaries serving in 16 cities. Indonesian Baptists now had 26 churches with more than 9,000 members. But in the months that followed, the mission was quietly voicing its concern. It was at a prayer retreat in February 1971 that the tremendous success the missionaries had enjoyed among the Javanese people began to give way to an uneasy feeling that something was wrong. Their work had come a long way in 20 years, but they began to question the very methods that had been so successful. Missionary Ed Sanders is the current administrator of the Indonesia mission.
We as a mission tried to analyze why we didn't do a better job of winning more people between 1965 and 70. And we did win, a good number, but not as many as other churches had. And we just came to the conclusion that we weren't as spread out as far as our ministry was concerned. And the methodology that we were using was not the proper methodology. So we decided, let's do a survey of our work.
We did a self-study. We tried to figure out what we're actually doing, what's actually happening, what are our churches doing, what are our pastors doing. we were going to come together and figure out, do we need to try to make some changes in the way we do mission work? And actually the Lord took hold of that situation in a way that even now is hard to explain or describe to others. A spontaneous spiritual renewal, revival movement broke out among the missionaries. Just a classic time of the Spirit of God coming down and touching people as we began to confess our sins to one another and pray for one another and reaffirm one another in love and recognize the fact that we had been depending too much on who we are and the money that Southern Baptists would give to support us and the ways we had always done things.
I think one of the primary results of the survey was that we recognized that we need a methodology that is reproducible, a methodology that's reproducible by our national brethren. In starting churches, we would buy land, build buildings. We would take students from the seminary, pay their salaries, and, you know, the idea was that you would pay a salary for a pastor until the church was strong enough, but our experience was they never got strong enough. They always needed that money from the mission. And if we were going to start thousands of house churches, if we were going to expand our ministry to other islands and throughout Java, there is no way we were going to have the money to pay the salaries and build the buildings for each church like we had done previously.
Another area of focus was seminary education. Experience had taught the mission that young seminary students, given the promise of mission support after graduation, wanted to start new churches in the cities. Life for them and for their families was better in the city. But the real growth among the Javanese was in the villages, in the countryside, and if theological education was going to encourage growth outside the city, it had to go to the countryside too. Another consideration was that if young pastors were going to have to support themselves, they couldn't afford to travel hundreds of miles to a seminary and spend several years studying. So the mission turned to the concept of theological education by extension, or TEE. Programs were started throughout Java to teach theology by extension. With its seminary teachers reassigned to the T programs, the main campus for a time was closed. The reaction by Indonesian Baptists was immediate.
Tiba-tiba ada keputusan dari orang yang diharapkan ini, demikian di luar.
This decision was made without our knowledge, and we could not grasp the reasons.
Mungkin kalau keputusan itu diberitahukan, dikasih.
Maybe if we had been told of the possibility a year ahead or something like that.
Tapi seingat saya, waktu itu langsung.
But no, it was cut off. Just cut off.
Indonesian Baptists moved to start their own convention, and by August of that year, the Union of Indonesian Baptist Churches was formed. Their message was clear. We want to have control of our own churches in our own country. Despite repeated attempts, the mission was unable to convince the National Convention of the reasons for the changes. During the next 14 years, the relationship between the mission and the convention was strained at best.
You know, we could have gone to other countries. We could have even found somebody else to work with. But this was a church that we had birthed, and we were committed to see it work because we felt God had called us here. And he had led us to bring these people together. And although we made mistakes and they made mistakes, we couldn't get away from Ephesians 4, where it said we are to guard the unity of the church. And we knew that things had to get better sometime.
In a way, it was an extension of the same determination that had brought the young nation together in the first place. The desire to chart their own destinies.
The National Convention said we would like to take more control of our Baptist identity, of our Baptist way of life. And we want the missionaries to realize that you are temporary. Our church, God's Baptist church, is going to be here in Indonesia a long time. And so we had what we call the turning of the devolutional ball from missionary leadership to the development of the National Convention. And this is never done without a great deal of tension. Now we see that as this developed, some of the ideas that the mission sowed in their seeds of village evangelism, of opening new churches, of strengthening Baptist work, all of these have become primary goals of the National Convention. They have accepted these. They have identified with them. The National Convention had to establish its own identity and control of the situation.
Well, the Lord finally brought us through those hard years. There was no one dramatic breakthrough. We began to work together more. We began to meet together more. We've never had a complete break in relationships. We've come to a better working agreement. We've come to ways where we can use subsidies creatively in working with Indonesian Baptists. For instance, we don't just build a church building for anybody anymore, but we do put money into a church loan fund. A church can go to this Baptist loan fund and borrow money where they couldn't borrow it anywhere else, or at better rates than anywhere else. And as they pay it back, the reasonable interest they pay, of course, helps the fund to grow. We work with the Indonesian Baptist Union in sending perhaps a missionary and a national together to places where either of us would have a hard time getting in by ourselves. We do want to use the wealth that the Lord has given Baptists in America. We want it to be used here. It's not that we want to block it. It is simply that we do not want it to be used in a way that arouses an unrealistic expectation or sets up an unreproducible model for Indonesians.
The foundation that the missionaries help us to lay is a good foundation. And though it had its breaks, now it is a firm foundation. And I am very thankful to God for that.
The mission and the young National Convention had weathered some difficult times, and there were still challenges that lay ahead. But the tensions of the early 70s had been replaced by a spirit of cooperation that would help lead them into the future. What is the vision for the future that propels Indonesian Baptists? And who are some of the dynamic leaders that will help shape the future? We'll tell you in our next report. Today, Indonesian Baptists number more than 35,000 members and 260 churches and 300 mission points. This building houses the offices of the Indonesian Baptist Union. From here, denominational leaders are charting strategies for growth that will take Indonesian Baptists into the next century. Everywhere you look, Baptist work is growing. From small mission points to big city churches, Indonesian Baptists see evangelism and church growth as their main focus for the rest of this decade and into the 21st century.
Saya mengharap bahwa gereja-gereja Baptis Indonesia masih menjadi gereja Baptis Injili.
I hope that our Baptist churches will be evangelistic churches, not only in name but also in practice. And that truly every Baptist will share the gospel personally.
Mengabarkan Injil secara pribadi. Badan Pengurus Pusat Gabungan Gereja Baptis Indonesia mencanangkan program iman.
That is why after our 5th Congress, the Executive Committee of the Baptist Union planned the program of faith called the 5+1+1 program.
Memulai satu
During the 5 years period from 1990 to 1995, every church will begin a new church.